This is Behind the Mic with Kirkus Reviews, where the subjects are audiobooks and the actors who narrate them. I'm Joe Reed, and with me, Stephen Cummings. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Joe. How are you today?
I'm very good. It's spring. I'm happy.
Me too. Love it.
I know what you're talking about this week. Share with our listeners.
Yeah, I'm interested in talking a bit about the status of work in the United States, not to get too serious on this beautiful spring day, but the books we're going to be talking about all touch on that subject. First one is Apple, The First 50 Years. This is written and read by David Pogue. The second book is Mutiny, written by Noam Scheiber and narrated by Andre Santana. The third book is Upward Bound, written by Woody Brown, with a host of narrators throughout this book.
Upward Bound is the novel in this group.
Upward Bound is the novel. The other two are nonfiction. My hope is to thread these just a little bit, and hopefully that makes sense by the time we get to the third book.
All right. Well, we're starting with Apple, The First 50 Years.
This is written and read by David Pogue, and I think this is a fun, inspired telling of the Apple story. So even if you've read other books or seen other movies, I recommend this book because it's comprehensive and it really does capture these first 50 years, as the title goes. This was nominated for an Earphones Award, and Pogue notes as he radiates this in his narration. He carries this book entertainingly. I'm sometimes skeptical when you have a nonfiction book read by the author. He does a fantastic job. Of course, he's got a background in using his voice. The audiobook captures some of the well-known history that's actually a little nostalgic for some of us out here who are familiar with Apple products, and it's a fascinating evolution of how the Apple computer brand has changed over time. As a Generation Xer, that's me, I grew up learning about computers directly by use of the Apple II computer, which was very present in schools across the United States, which was by design and kind of built in this brand identification among people of my age. The audiobook itself adapts to things like using sound clips, which is one of the fun things about audiobooks. So snippets of Steve Jobs, his famous keynotes, appear in the audiobook. Software sound samples appear. And I think that's really important because design of technology includes very thoughtful creation of sound. So that appears here and there as well throughout this book. Also, pivotal commercial soundtracks appear. I think some of us may remember the really famous 1984 commercial during the Super Bowl that year. And if you don't remember, it's the one with the woman who's running with the mallet who chucks it at the screen and takes out Big Brother. And there's a clip of that here as well. And there's some story and background about how that commercial came to be.
I think the audio clips are such a smart move because they're not just nostalgic. Mm-hmm. When I was listening, they actually pull me back into that moment.
Yeah, it does. And it helps really set the tone for where this is a history. This is the idea of where has this company come from and where is it going? And it does capture it. Up until the last year or so, of course, since this book has come out, Tim Cook is stepping down. There's some reshuffling. This is just the nature of things, but it brings us up to just that point. Now, Pogue is a correspondent for CBS This Morning. He's a tech columnist for the New York Times for many years. He's done several TED Talks. So again, all confidence, he does a great job with this, makes a lot of fun to listen to. He knows this material and he knows the main players in Apple's history very well. And at one point, for example, Pogue relays a story about a criticism he wrote regarding a product, only to have Steve Jobs contact him directly to berate him. Of course, if you are familiar with the personality of Steve Jobs, that should come as no surprise. He was very capricious in that way. It's a story that captures friction between the journalists, especially tech journalists, and their coverage of Apple, particularly when Jobs oversaw the company's direction. So all of this is to capture this idea of working. Of course, you hear about the shifts of leadership in Apple and how it became so strong by some major changes and choices in who's leading the company. And all this ambition and explosive financial growth, however, doesn't always translate to things like meaningful, well-paying jobs, which we'll talk about in the next book. But we do have stylish Apple stores where direct staffers are expected to sell these products. More of that in a moment.
Again, back to those clips, those old clips, especially the ads, made me think about how much of Apple has always been about presentation, about creating a feeling as much as a product. And I remember the first Apple product I got, I could not believe how beautifully it was packaged.
They talk about packaging, and all of that is highly intentional. I got
Oh, yeah.
I remember opening my first ever iPod back in
Yeah.
2003 and thinking, this is the product of the year, because you're just taking it out and you're already on board with where it's going. It's imbuing a sense of confidence in what you're about to interact with. And a lot of their products are simply like that. So I note that that's a key component to the experience of this brand and what they're selling.
Design, functionality, and also really does not play well with others.
No, it doesn't. They used to say that. I've noticed they quietly stopped saying that a while ago.
It's so true, though. And Pogue is an enthusiastic narrator. I mean, he sounds like he's just talking to you or talking to me. And I like that slightly amused insider tone, but not an insider tone that made me feel excluded, more like somebody who's been around enough to know where the myths are, able to point those out, but still gets a kick out of the story.
Yeah, I really liked where the balance was with this, because on the one hand, I have experienced stories or read things written by true Apple fans. And Apple fans tend to overlook a lot of stuff, a lot of problematic things or breakdowns or issues. And to Pogue's credit, he doesn't do that. He's enthusiastic about the subject, but he's also willing to be critical. He's willing to bring out some of the stories, and he's willing to help kind of correct the record a few times throughout this. So I really appreciated his approach to this material.
Well, shall we hear a clip?
So here we get a sense of some of the background on Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Those are two of the originators of this whole company. And speaking of work, this all really started out of garages back in those days. Wozniak, who's known as the Woz to his fans, is historically considered the true engineer of the two. The computer programmer building the hardware, the guts, all that stuff. And Jobs is the idea man. He's the visionary with the long view vision of the business. So Pogue relays this history with a nimble, almost juvenile tone. I love that. That works for this material. So if you have any background on the leader that Steve Jobs was, this passage will not necessarily be a surprise.
This is Apple, the First 50 Years. It's written and read by David Pogue.
That Woz would ever meet Steve Jobs was by no means a sure thing. They lived 15 minutes apart and went to the same high school. But because Woz was 4 years older than Jobs, they didn't overlap. Jobs had begun building his reputation for both brilliance and disruption before he was even out of elementary school. "You should have seen us in 3rd grade. We basically destroyed our teacher," Jobs would say. "We would let snakes loose in the classroom and explode bombs." He skipped 5th grade, landing at Crittenden Middle School at 10 years old. It was a tough place to be for an underage loner. Some kids brought knives to school. School administrators routinely called the police to break up fights. By 7th grade, he was bullied and miserable. He gave his parents an ultimatum. If they made him stay at Crittenden, he would quit school altogether.
That's certainly an instructive story. And it's interesting how much Jobs knew his own self-worth, even then.
Yeah, I do admire his, I admire his confidence. I've learned enough about Steve Jobs to admire the work he did, but also thank the Lord I never worked for the guy.
Oh, yeah.
But,
no, I agree. But I think this clip also illustrates sort of that bright conversational tone of Pogue's, both his writing and his reading of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I give credit to Pogue for being a journalist throughout this, but also being an enthusiastic journalist and really enjoying the subject, even though he's able to kind of see it for what it is sometimes. And that's really helpful for this listening experience.
The next book we want to talk about is Mutiny, The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class by Noam Scheiber, narrated by Andre Santana. And that sort of is a little peek about how the reality on the ground wasn't always so shiny at Apple.
Yes, and so I will preface this by saying I listened to these two books literally one after the other.
Which came first?
Apple, The First 50 Years came first. And then I listened to this one. And they connected so well because they're going to talk about the same thing. So this is a nonfiction audiobook capturing the current labor crisis and efforts for organizing in this rapidly changing makeup of those who seek to unionize. This is an Earphones Award winner as well. It's narrated by Andre Santana. It's nonfiction, and Apple factors in directly, as does other major companies. And I will disclose that I'm a customer of Starbucks. Starbucks appears in this. I have been a customer of Amazon. Amazon appears in this. And these are employers that once represented a kind of stopgap employment for college-educated young adults, but that in this world is not necessarily the case anymore, where some people are actually working longer hours and building more of a career around these spaces. So this book really captures various on-the-ground interviews with various characters to help illustrate how this demographic is something of a newer phenomenon. Employers like Starbucks and Apple, for example, deliberately embrace a kind of open-minded brand, by the way. And if going back to the first book we talked about, this first audiobook, one of the mottos or mantras that you hear is that Apple is where the liberal arts meets technology. And they really encourage people to see it from that artistic point of view. This phrase appears in this audiobook as well. And it appears in a more ironic context because there are people working in Apple stores where they feel like this is actually not how we're being treated. There's one firsthand discussion from an employer who talks about how they came to Apple wanting to bring that creative thinking, but over the years, there's been a shift towards just pushing and selling more and trying to get people to buy more expensive niche products. One of the examples is this recent Apple Vision Pro, which is a kind of headset that you put on to experience virtual reality, and it's very expensive. It's described in the book, it looks like somebody who's snorkeling, but it's this idea that really, if you've got $3,500, you'll want to enjoy this. What does that say about the product, and what does it say about the people who are expected to sell it?
Exactly.
Yeah, the organizing that takes place in these venues is contrasted against this image of a factory labor environment from the last century. I grew up in a town where there was a manufacturing plant, and they went on strike a couple of times when I was a younger person. And I had friends who were really directly affected by that type of labor organizing. That was the spirit. Now we're in this new space where people really just want benefits. They want to be treated to a living wage. They want to survive. And the step they've realized to take is we've got to organize around this.
It's interesting because it's almost as though you're in college and you're going to work at the Apple store, you're going to work at Starbucks, maybe Amazon, but you graduate from college and you can't get the job that you thought you would get. And you're still at Apple and you're still at Starbucks. And
yeah,
I didn't listen to the whole book. I listened into it, but it looks like that's the focus of Scheiber's book, The College Educated, as the title says, the college educated working class. That used to be, at one time, what we would call the professional managerial class.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you think about it, we used to have a labor structure that said, look, if you do this, you'll get this. If you come and work 40 hours a week at this plant or wherever, then you'll be paid a wage that will help you sustain a household, a family, what have you. The American dream, as it will.
Unionized, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And unions were strong. That was a component of that. Of course, now we're in a much different space. And the college educated, remember, they're not just people looking for a broader perspective of life and the step up, but they're carrying a lot of debt. In fact, it's brought up several times throughout this book that you've got folks that are trying to pay that debt off from college, and that's just not going to happen unless some changes are made. So Andre Santana, by the way, let me talk about the narrator. He fits this so well. He's got the voice that fits the tone of this book. He's a younger sounding person. I don't know if there's a better way to say that, but he sounds like the kind of person you would encounter at an Apple Genius bar or a Starbucks who would fit in with those staffers. And so there's a kind of embed feel to how he gives his narration to the listeners. And that, of course, carries the day throughout this because we're talking about this new world where people are organizing under new environments and for new goals. So I felt like I could really hear this clear, unadorned voice throughout this entire audiobook.
Andre has done a range of audiobooks, and I mean a range from, kids' books and young adult books, books like the News Crew series by Walter Dean Myers for younger readers, to Roberto Bolaño's Woes of the True Policeman. And everything in between. And I think he has a way of sounding as though he's right there in the conversation. He's not above it. He's not narrating it from a distance. As you said, plain spoken in the best sense, which I think really suits a book that's built out of a lot of firsthand accounts.
Absolutely. I really love how you capture that, because that was the sense I got listening to this book. And yes, Andre's incredibly talented and has done a lot of things. And he just fits so well. That's, I guess, I attribute all of that to the skill of the performer. And he does such an excellent job with this book. And because this book really gets into some really important things, and there's a little bit of humor in here too, at the expense of these companies. For example, I mentioned those Apple stores. Apple ships in, or at least they used to at the onset of the stores, this really expensive stone from Italy. And in this audiobook, one of the employees says, I don't care how expensive that stone is. It's hard to stand on that stuff for 8 hours a day. And that's what you're expecting us to do. Again, I want to thread these two books in that way because it really speaks to an experience that goes all the way to the folks that go to work for these companies.
And how does Amazon factor into this? I mean, I know working conditions are not great, but how does the working class college graduate factor into Amazon?
Amazon is a great example of how they are instituting more and more automation to increase productivity. At the end of the day, you've got to get products to people's front doors. And so that's an example of where employees are coming in and trying to figure out, well, how do I survive this? Amazon is not necessarily carrying the same brand connection as those other companies that we're talking about, but they're using a kind of employment model that is impacting employees in the same way. Very limited benefits necessarily, although I should say, I'm saying this from the perspective of how the book captures it. But it's how the employees are being impacted by what they're expected to do in a specific shift and how they're getting reimbursed for that. Mm-hmm. And all of this includes college-aged people who are looking for ways to get employed in this rapidly shifting work environment where we have a lot of unknowns, especially when it comes to the implementation of things like artificial intelligence, for example.
All right. I want to hear an example of Andre.
So here we are. And this is just not to set up too much of this, but this is a great example of Andre's approach to conveying this material. And it also captures essentially the thesis of this book as well.
This is Mutiny, the Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class, written by Noam Scheiber, narrated by Andre Santana.
I had been covering a labor organizing campaign at Starbucks since the previous year, when 2 locations in the Buffalo, New York area shocked the company by voting to unionize. At that point, baristas around the country decided that a union sounded like a pretty good idea to them, too. More than 250 Starbucks stores had voted to unionize since then, making it one of the fastest-spreading union campaigns in decades. The company, notwithstanding its progressive image, was unenthused. Starbucks managers fired or disciplined dozens of union supporters, saying the workers broke company rules. The company's executives introduced new benefits that they denied union stores, saying the union had to bargain for them, while Starbucks lawyers walked out of bargaining sessions 10 minutes after they began, citing violations of protocol. Company officials said they were following the law while generally signaling that they would rather snort unsweetened soy milk than cede ground to a union.
Snort soy milk is a very nice touch, which I like. But I also like that it's underplayed by Andre. Yeah. He has a restraint that he brings to this, not just with the soy milk, but, with the frustration and fatigue with organizing. That's in the book too. And Andre just lets it come through naturally. And I think restraint often, and in this case does, make the stories land a little harder.
I think that the restraint is really important. It's almost a dryness to it, but it's the idea that, look, I'm just telling you how it is, and how it is includes these sort of humorous points along the way, capturing this larger spirit of where folks are at. I really appreciate that as well, so I'm glad you pointed that out.
And now we're moving to our novel, which is Upward Bound, written by Woody Brown and narrated by a multicast.
It is. It's narrated by a handful. It's kind of interesting because this is the shortest book of the 3 by far. This is under 5 hours if you listen to it. Woody Brown is the author, and it's narrated by Daphne Rubin-Vega, Alex Edelman, Pete Holmes, Midori Francis, Carlos Miranda, Brandon Flynn, T.R. Knight, and Nikki M. James. So a large cast of voices here, again, for a shorter book. Now, Upward Bound is a novel. It's making a big splash, and part of that is because the author, Woody Brown, is someone with autism. He's nonverbal. And while this is a novel, I listened to his thinking, well, of course, he's going to be speaking from his experience because the main character, Walter, narrates this book mostly by conveying his thoughts to the audience. In reality, in his experience in the book, he can only convey certain words at certain times, which he struggles to retrieve as he's trying to talk to people. So what we're hearing from his perspective is his inner discussion.
And Upward Bound is basically an adult day program for disabled people.
It is. And so that's where the title comes from. It's an example of the kind of program like this that's relatively underfunded, poorly staffed. And again, the thread here for me is the employment of it all. And so who's working, who's providing support, as well as who's being served. It's clear from the onset that the center is something of a dead end for Walter. It's a place for adults to get general care, but really little else. In fact, in this audiobook, one of the highlights for the adults being served by Upward Bound is a trip to the department store, which doesn't even have a function other than just to get them out of the building. So various actors perform the characters, and each actor captures a chapter. I won't be able to go through all of them, except that I think that they all do a fantastic job. Now, T.R. Knight, of course, is a well-known actor. He does the voice of Walter, and he's a standout here. He's a young man with autism who graduates from high school. He's able to attend local community college. And in his life, he can only find those single words like I mentioned. So he's very expressive to us in what his experiences are. Now, I also enjoyed Midori Francis. She's the voice of a young college student who gets hired almost on the spot by the director because she's got lifeguard skills. When she mentions that, boom, she's hired. However, she has a natural ability, this character, to speak directly to the adults at the center. And that is incredibly important because Walter and others will note that often no one talks to them. They just sort of talk around them, but they're often ignored. So this is something I thought was very moving in her performance. And then Pete Holmes is also a well-known comedian actor, and he's the voice of Dave, the center's director. And he once aspired to be an actor, but he had to recalibrate those dreams, and still insists on planning a holiday pageant at the center. Now that's a little problematic. Why? Well, these are adults. Do we really need to be doing should we be doing a holiday pageant of adults? One wonders. So that's another component of this book, which I thought was an interesting detail.
We have to give a shout out to Carlos, who is such a kind man, who is one of the caretakers there and really finds purpose in being a caretaker.
And I think that one of the reasons why I really appreciated where this audiobook went and how it conveyed these stories is that it really got into that space with those characters and how compassionate they can be. And yet these places, these centers don't always have the ability to bring in the best of the best. And this for a variety of reasons. And one is that they're very underpaid places. So when you have somebody like Carlos, absolutely. So I note these moments as a way to capture an idea of what work means in this environment. The staffing pay is low, as I noticed, and in Walter's case, the entire purpose of the center is an unfortunate mismatch. He's got so much potential if he could only work with folks who can work with him. And so he's essentially ignored, or his intellect is masked, and that's heartbreaking. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this book was because of that story. And I really appreciated, in this instance, how T.R. Knight performs this position.
No, agreed. And what I thought was interesting, the setting itself, it's a place that at first it feels almost static, like a holding area. But it really is full of life that gradually reveals all these, as you say, mismatches between what the program offers and what people like Walter actually need. And I really thought the performances really don't push that idea. They just let it be. They let it sit there.
Again, when you go too hard, and I think that I've read a number of books that cover an environment like this, and I sometimes feel like the message is hammered to the reader. This is bad. This needs to change. And so I liked that. I liked how the performances in particular really let the listener come to certain thoughts and conclusions about what they're listening to.
I agree. Let's listen.
This clip is Walter, performed by T.R. Knight. He's at the Upward Bound Center, and he's observing the routine that unfolds each day, and he muses on how staff behave and regard the clients.
Upward Bound, written by Woody Brown. It's a multicast, and as Stephen said, we're going to hear from T.R. Knight.
I was sitting in the rec room, waiting to be told what to do next, when I saw Jorge slip out via the back door that leads to the pool in the parking lot. There were probably a dozen of us inmates in the rec room. A few staffers were there, but they were huddled in a group, talking with great animation about an episode of Love Island. Mom wouldn't watch that show, so I hadn't seen it either. Sounds contentious, but also sexy. If Carlos had been there, he'd have told them to get back to work. But he'd have said it in a cool way that wouldn't make anyone resentful. The staffers obviously felt no urgency to set up our next activity. You could tell that it didn't even occur to them that we might mind being left waiting, as if time means nothing to people who have nothing but time. I think it's the opposite. Our time is wasted so profitably that we cherish it for what it might be, not for its emptiness.
T.R. Knight is so good at giving Walter this rich inner life. And you just feel how sharp and observant Walter is. And it's a balance that works so well, I think.
I completely agree. I think T.R. Knight does such a great job with the empathy of it all. He's got to do something really difficult here. He's got to convey to us a real subject who is having a conversation with nobody except himself and then to us.
Exactly.
And yet at the same time help us understand that he can't put those same words out into the world. And so one of the things I really loved about this was how he was able to get me to really come to that point really right away. He doesn't have a lot of time to do that. So here we are. And it's a really standout performance here.
Stephen, a pleasure as always.
What can I say? Love talking with you, Joe. I love that we're enjoying our spring weather together in our different places and that we got to talk about these 3 books today.
And I'll talk to you next month.
Wonderful. Thank you.
This is Behind the Mic with Kirkus Reviews. Behind the Mic drops on Thursdays, and if you follow us, we'll simply appear in your feed. And then follow Fully Booked by Kirkus Reviews. Fully Booked is the podcast for book lovers. Every Tuesday, host Megan LaBreeze brings you author interviews, industry insights, and recommendations from the bestseller list. Find your next great book on Fully Booked by Kirkus Reviews. You can follow Fully Booked and Behind the Mic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. And then stop by kirkusreviews.com to check out reviews for both print and audiobooks. Behind the Mic is produced by Jessica Lockhart, Michelle Cobb, Stephen Cummings, Leslie Fine, Alan Minskoff, Alex Ritchie, Laura Rossi, Laura Simeon, and Kendra Winchester are our contributors. Jennifer Dahl is our editor, with assistance from Alicia Langerman. Tom Beer is the executive producer. The music is William Ross Chernoff's Nomad's 4-Way. And I'm your host, Joe Reed. Good listening.